Hi, welcome to the quiz. You can answer along on quizalto.com, all for free. The exact URL of this quiz will be in the notes down below. Let's get started, good luck. How is AWS Lambda built? Based on the amount of storage used. Based on the number of virtual machines used. Based on the number of users accessing the service. Based on the number of requests and the duration of code execution. AWS Lambda pricing is based on the number of requests for your functions and the time your code executes, rounded up to the nearest millisecond. What is the AWS Lambda concurrency limit by default? 3,000. 5,000. 1,000. 500. The default concurrency limit for AWS Lambda is 1,000 concurrent executions per AWS account per region. What is the purpose of AWS Lambda's event source mapping? To associate an event source with a Lambda function. To monitor events from multiple sources. To create a new event source. To store events in S3. Event source mapping in AWS Lambda is used to associate an event source, such as an SQS or Kinesis stream, with a Lambda function to process incoming events. What is the purpose of AWS Lambda's dead letter queue? To queue synchronous invocations. To manage function timeouts. To store function logs. To capture failed asynchronous invocations. AWS Lambda's dead letter queue captures failed asynchronous invocations, allowing you to analyze and troubleshoot errors. How do you deploy code to AWS Lambda? By setting up an EC2 instance. By creating an RDS instance. By configuring a VPC. By uploading a deployment package or using an inline editor. You can deploy code to AWS Lambda by uploading a deployment package through the Lambda console, CLI, or SDKs, or by using the inline code editor provided in the Lambda console. What is AWS Lambda? A service to store large amounts of data. A compute service that lets you run code without provisioning or managing servers. A service to monitor application performance. A service to manage user authentication. AWS Lambda is a serverless compute service that automatically runs your code in response to events and scales the underlying compute resources as needed. What is the maximum size of a deployment package for AWS Lambda when using an S3 bucket? 100 megabytes. 10 megabytes. 50 megabytes. 250 megabytes. The maximum size of a deployment package that you can upload directly to AWS Lambda is 50 megabytes. For larger packages, you must use an S3 bucket. Which AWS service can be used to invoke AWS Lambda functions on a schedule? AWS Snowball. Amazon Guard Duty. Amazon CloudWatch Events. AWS Direct Connect. Amazon CloudWatch events can be used to invoke AWS Lambda functions based on a schedule you define, similar to a cron job. What is the AWS Lambda execution role? An IAM role that grants the function permissions to use AWS services. A role that defines the network settings for the function. A role that manages user access to the AWS console. A role that specifies the memory and timeout settings. The AWS Lambda execution role is an IAM role that grants the function permissions to interact with other AWS services. Which of the following is true about AWS Lambda's integration with API Gateway? It enables creating RESTful APIs that trigger Lambda functions. It stores data processed by Lambda. It provides monitoring for Lambda functions. It secures Lambda functions. Amazon API Gateway can be used to create, publish, and secure APIs that trigger AWS Lambda functions upon HTTP requests. What does AWS Lambda use to run code? Bare metal servers. Virtual machines. Docker containers. Execution environments. AWS Lambda uses execution environments to run code, which are lightweight and managed by AWS. What is the maximum payload size that can be sent to an AWS Lambda function? 1 megabyte for synchronous invocation. 6 megabytes for synchronous invocation. 256 kilobytes for synchronous invocation. 10 megabytes for synchronous invocation. The maximum payload size for a synchronous invocation of an AWS Lambda function is 6 megabytes. Which of the following is a best practice for writing AWS Lambda functions? Writing monolithic functions. Using synchronous code only. Minimizing the function's package size. Maximizing the memory allocation to all functions. Minimizing the function's package size helps reduce cold start times and improve performance. What is AWS Lambda Snap Start? A feature that monitors Lambda functions. A feature that improves startup performance by caching and reusing snapshots of execution environments. A feature that scales Lambda functions. A feature that secures Lambda functions. AWS Lambda Snap Start is designed to improve startup performance by creating and caching snapshots of execution environments, reducing cold start latency. Which language is not supported by AWS Lambda? Node.js, Python, Java, COBOL. AWS Lambda natively supports Java, Go, PowerShell, Node.js, C#, Python, and Ruby. COBOL is not supported. What does AWS Lambda automatically monitor? Functions using Amazon CloudWatch. Databases using Amazon RDS. Network traffic using AWS VPC. Storage using Amazon S3. AWS Lambda automatically monitors functions using Amazon CloudWatch, providing metrics like invocation count, duration, and error count. What is AWS Lambda's destination feature? It monitors the memory usage of Lambda functions. It stores the code of Lambda functions. It allows you to route the outcome of a function execution to other services. It manages the VPC settings of Lambda functions. AWS Lambda's destination feature allows you to send the outcome of a function execution to other AWS services, such as SNS, SQS, Lambda, or EventBridge. Which of the following can AWS Lambda functions not directly integrate with? Amazon RDS, Amazon DynamoDB, Amazon Kinesis, Amazon S3. AWS Lambda cannot directly integrate with Amazon RDS. It can access RDS databases but not be triggered by them. It directly integrates with S3, Kinesis, and DynamoDB. What happens if your AWS Lambda function exceeds the configured memory? The function continues but with reduced performance. The function retries with higher memory. The function is terminated and logs an error. The function automatically scales up memory. If an AWS Lambda function exceeds its configured memory limit, it is terminated and an error is logged. What is AWS Lambda's relationship with AWS X-Ray? AWS X-Ray can be used to trace and analyze requests. AWS X-Ray monitors Lambda billing. AWS X-Ray stores Lambda function code. AWS X-Ray manages Lambda function permissions. AWS X-Ray can trace and analyze requests as they travel through your AWS Lambda functions, providing insights into performance bottlenecks and errors. What is the main advantage of using AWS Lambda with Amazon DynamoDB streams? To secure DynamoDB data. To query DynamoDB data. To process real-time data changes. To back up DynamoDB data. AWS Lambda can be triggered by Amazon DynamoDB streams to process real-time data changes, such as inserts, updates, and deletes. How does AWS Lambda handle failures during execution? By automatically scaling resources. By automatically retrying the execution twice for asynchronous invocations. By sending an alert and stopping execution. By stopping execution immediately. For asynchronous invocations, AWS Lambda automatically retries the execution twice if it fails initially. How does AWS Lambda interact with other AWS services? Using AWS config rules. Using CloudWatch logs to trigger actions. Using IAM roles to grant permissions. Using Amazon SNS to invoke functions. AWS Lambda uses IAM roles to grant functions the necessary permissions to interact with other AWS services. What is an AWS Lambda layer? A user management service. A storage service. A monitoring tool. A way to manage code and dependencies. An AWS Lambda layer is a distribution mechanism for libraries, custom runtimes, and other dependencies that you can use with your Lambda functions. Can AWS Lambda functions access resources in a VPC? Yes, with appropriate VPC configuration. No, Lambda functions cannot access VPC resources. Yes, but only for read operations. Yes, but only for write operations. AWS Lambda functions can access resources in a VPC by configuring the function to connect to the VPC with appropriate security groups and subnet settings. And that's a wrap. Thanks to everyone who participated. Remember, you can answer along on quizalto.com, where you can keep track of your progress and find much more quizzes. We hope you had a fun and challenging time. Until next time. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel for more. Hit the bell icon to be notified as soon as we upload. Please leave a comment if you have any thoughts or suggestions, and, if you think this video is worth sharing with someone who could benefit from it, please forward a link to them. See you next time. Thanks for watching.